The recent hurricane season is behind us, but one thing is certain. More storms are on the way, not to mention power outages, malware, and ransomware. The threats to business continuity are many, and protecting your organization has never been more challenging. Sooner or later, your preparedness will be tested. How can you be certain that you will be ready when the time comes? I am Stan Gibson, and I'll be your host and moderator for this live interactive webcast. Joining me to explore how to create and implement a resilient disaster recovery strategy are Len Guddemi, Vice President of Enterprise Solutions Recovery as a Service, MRP, for SunGuard Availability Services. Welcome, Len. It's great to have you here for this webcast.
Thank you, Stan. Good morning.
And Patrick Kenny, Director in the Data Protection Division of Dell EMC. Welcome, Patrick, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Stan. It's good to be with everyone.
Before we hear from those two experts, just a quick word about this webcast. Now, we are live and interactive, and that means we want to hear from you in our audience. Here's how to participate. When a question occurs to you, just type it into the Q&A box on your screen and then click Submit. We'll do our best to answer your question during the Q&A segment. Also, this webcast features several audience poll questions. When the question appears on your screen, please select the answer that seems best to you and then click Submit. We'll tally and discuss the results instantly. To enjoy these features, we do recommend disabling your pop-up blocker. And now, I'll hand things over to Len and Pat.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks on the phone, wherever you are today. So this morning, over the next 30 minutes to an hour, we're going to touch upon a few topics of the agenda. So we're going to talk about the impact of the most recent natural disasters and lessons learned, talk about protecting your organization, availability barriers that will protect your organization, and then also talk about moving from tape to disk. Patrick?
Yeah, so the second part of this webcast, we're going to be talking about cyber crimes. These are ever present in our new world, and we're going to talk about the relationship that we have with SunGuard to really reduce the impact of cybercrime, and we're going to introduce you into a isolated recovery solution using SunGuard Managed Services as a way to ultimately protect your data.
Great, thanks, Patrick. We're going to go now to our very first audience poll question in this webcast, and the question is very straightforward, and you may select more than one answer. The question is, has your company been affected by natural disaster, power outage, or cybercrime? Now, since it's very likely that your organization might have been affected by more than one of those, you may select more than one as your answer, but please remember to click that Submit button so we'll be able to see your response. Len and Patrick, these problems are very prevalent for many organizations. Most companies have been affected to some extent by cybercrime, even in a small way. I'm guessing that might get the most votes here. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the natural disasters and power outages are more frequent, and of course, cybercrime is increasing. So it's kind of interesting. I would think cybercrime as well, just because it's ubiquitous and it affects everyone. But it should be interesting to see what the poll results are.
I would think, phishing is very, very commonplace, and few organizations have not gotten a phishing email. I guess that would count as cybercrime. But, the natural disasters, if we have anyone in the Houston area, to be sure, this year, that would affect them. Any other thoughts before we look at the results? All right. Okay. Well, I think the people who are going to vote have probably voted at this point. Remember to hit that Submit button so we'll be able to see your preference. And okay, so let's look at the results. And got. All right. Well, interestingly, cybercrime is in first place, but not by much. Power outage and natural disaster both polled pretty strongly there. Any thoughts on those results, Len or Patrick?
I would say last year at this time, it probably would have been more focused on cybercrime, but with the natural disasters, and we definitely see more power outages throughout the world on a regular basis. I'm not surprised by the results, but cybercrime, as we predicted, is number one.
Yeah, I agree. We'll chat a little bit about types of disruptions in a little bit from a SunGuard AS perspective, but I'm not surprised by the results either.
All right. Well, thanks, Len and Patrick. I'll hand things back to you at this point.
Okay, again, good morning, folks. So what I want to chat about real quick is what you see on the screen illustrates the support of alerts and disasters that SunGuard AS supported for events that happened this year, both domestic and across the globe. So you'll see the number of alerts and declarations that we supported. So one point to note out from an alert perspective, and alerts from a SunGuard AS perspective is when customers will alert us. They won't declare a declaration. They'll just put us on alert to inform us that they potentially could have an issue. But one point to note out with those number of alerts is a lot of customers could not actually invoke a declaration because their contracts were undersubscribed with us as a service provider. And I'll talk about how to avoid that as part of some of the availability barriers. But that was interesting to note that a lot of customers could not invoke their contracts with us because their contracts were undersubscribed. This is just some news clips from local newspapers regarding the declarations that happened or the events that happened from the current hurricanes, and also some of the floods in India and the earthquakes in Mexico. So over the 30 years that we've been supporting customers, the left side of the chart or the slide talks about the types of disasters, and you can see that over 700 plus of our recoveries in 30 years were due to infrastructure type of events, and over the next slide, the next 600 plus are due to weather related, and you'll see that there's other types of events from terrorism, and then to the right of the screen, you'll see some common lessons learned. So just some points to note from a lessons learned perspective was some intangibles from a recovery perspective, like lack of transportation, logistics, key players unavailable or missing. One anecdotal type of story is during the 9/11 events back 16 years ago, there was a client that actually lost the majority of their DR team. So it's important to understand from a lessons learned perspective how you approach if you have folks that are unavailable from a DR perspective. Another interesting lessons learned was communications down. Same story from 9/11, which was interesting, was that when the Verizon CO was impacted in Tower 4, that impacted roughly about 8 to 12 mile radius in that downtown Manhattan area, which was interesting to note that a lot of customers were impacted because of communication. So from a resiliency perspective, have you actually looked at how communications could impact you that are in a certain type of radial area surrounds your production environment where you may have not taken that into consideration from a resiliency perspective? Some other lessons learned: contracts out of date from your vendors, from a media perspective, from fuel, outdated documentation, scripts, disaster declaration authorization, who's authorized to declare a disaster from your organization. Extended recovery is not in the plan. A lot of vendors today, from a service provider perspective, provide clients 6 weeks of recovery. But if you have the recovery in a longer type of or an extended type of a plan, have you actually documented that as part of your environment? And some other lessons learned: lack of business continuity plans, difficulty accessing tapes or documentations. So those are some of the lessons learned that we have kind of looked at with our clients over our 30 years in doing business. So let's talk about some of the availability barriers that you could you could look at from an IT perspective. So when we look at significant business challenges from an IT perspective, so today in IT, a lot of customers are looking to go to market faster, more efficient, market opportunities from digital transformation, but it requires a kind of a new bimodal agile IT. So what do I mean by bimodal agile IT from mode 1 to mode 2? From an application perspective, and I talk about applications because applications is really the most an important factor from a resiliency perspective. So applications and customers that are moving applications to cloud recovery or moving workloads to cloud, but there are some applications that can't be virtualized, or maybe there's some legacy applications that can't be virtualized, and that creates kind of a very complex environment from an IT perspective, and it becomes difficult to recover because a lot of applications may span across multiple platforms from a perspective. And what are some of the things that look from a tension perspective that may kind of enhance these significant business challenges? So a lot of customers want faster recovery times from an RTO perspective. There are certain employee behaviors that are important to understand from an IT perspective. You know, when I talk to customers across the country, I talk about how resiliency in DR becomes a very cultural shift in an organization. So culturally, how are you handling your employees from a training perspective, from a knowledge perspective, when you talk about resiliency? I talked about how some applications are very difficult to virtualize and move to a cloud, and that becomes a very complex environment to recover. Insufficient people and resources. You know, we talk about how a lot of customers today in IT wear multiple hats, and they have to focus on production because production is really what's generating your IP and generating revenue for your organization. But there's a need for DR, and it comes down to there's insufficient people and resources to manage both production and DR. How are you handling the constant growth of storage and data in today's environment? And obviously last is really the compliance environment, the being compliant from a HIPAA perspective, from a Sarbanes-Oxley perspective. So how are you handling compliance from a resiliency perspective? So are you really reducing business risk? So on the right hand of the slide, it talks about the compounded annual growth from a cloud-based perspective. That talks about 13 to 55% of clients are moving workloads and moving environments to cloud. But to the left of the slide, it talks about the maturity of 854 clients that actually Gartner surveyed from a business maturity perspective as it relates to DR and really recovering mission-critical RTOs. So as you can see, level 5 is your most mature client out there in the industry today, and actually you see there's nobody at a level 5 perspective. So you'll see that there are a lot of customers today that are very, very immature when it comes from recovering RTOs. And what I mean about level of maturity is how are you handling the levels of recoverability when you talk about resiliency. For example, and I have a slide that I'll talk about in a little bit of the methodology, but protecting your data, the compute layer, how are you managing your recovery, the people processing governance, documentation, all of the aspects of resiliency, and how are you handling application mapping, how are you handling change. So all the aspects of resiliency. So in this slide it talks about how a lot of customers out there are really in a very immature type of state. And this slide just kind of reemphasizes the point about maturity, how roughly 75% of customers are exposed from a resiliency perspective. 67% had incidents that negatively impacted their business operations. 24% were considered mature, and 25% really looked at they haven't mastered incident response and recovery from an IT perspective. So let's talk about how you overcome some availability barriers. So there's 10 steps to really needed to overcome barriers. So the first one really talks about have you identified business availability requirements? Have you really looked about how your business can be impacted from an availability perspective? Have you gone and done an extensive business impact analysis. A lot of customers out there today always look at protecting the glass house or protecting the compute or the infrastructure layer, but has the business looked at how it really can be impacted from a financial perspective, from an economic perspective, and really identifying what the requirements are to really recover your business. Understanding your risks, your IT risks, from a resiliency perspective. The third one is really mapping your IT dependencies. A lot of customers today that I speak to really struggle with application mapping and really identifying dependencies. A lot of customers out there don't have the proper tools to look at true application mapping and how it really relates to a business process and how it relates to really the compute layer. And that really is where customers are struggling today, is really identifying IT dependencies and how those dependencies really span across multiple technologies. Tiering your application. I know Patrick's going to talk about application tiering and the criticality, but I'll just touch upon, have you really looked at how you tier your applications and the criticality about recovering those applications? A lot of customers today will look at tiering from tier 0 all the way through tier X, whether it be tier 5 or tier 4. Tier 0 is really a core infrastructure. And have you really looked at the recoverability of your tiers of applications from a recovery time perspective? Applying the right technologies from a resiliency perspective. So what do I mean about applying the right technology? So a lot of customers today in the IT space will apply certain technologies based upon their recovery times, their RTOs based upon applications. So we live in a very, very hybrid environment today where a lot of customers are recovering based upon application criticality. So tier 0 could be an active environment where the RTO is 0 hour, and maybe a tier 3 or tier 4 application, you're applying maybe a tape-based recovery or maybe applying some type of cloud recovery. So it's really looking at applying the right technologies. Have you documented your, the processes around recovery? When you talk to customers today in IT, we always talk about technology. And the way I articulate to a lot of customers today is technology is the enabler. It's really about people, process, and governance around the technology. So from a resiliency perspective, have you really looked at the processes around the technology and the documentation around the technology and how you orchestrate recovery? And then from an SLA perspective, I always tell customers that when you look at service providers, a lot of service providers today will provide SLAs around technology. So it's really about SLAs around application recovery or application availability. How do you protect your data today? One of the core principles is really, from a resiliency perspective, is protecting the data. So how do you protect the data today? Do you export it out of the business? Do you do tape-based type recovery? Are you doing SAN-based replication? Are you moving data to the cloud? So it's really looking at how you protect the data today. And then connecting the recovery data to the servers and environment. So it's really this is rudimentary, it's elementary, it's really how you connect your recovery to the compute environment. Number 9 is really identifying clear roles and responsibilities. I talked about that one example of how that one customer really lost their key individuals during 9/11. So it's really identifying clear roles and responsibilities. And the last one is really how do you handle lifecycle change? It's really about handling change management from a production and DR perspective. So really, this slide, and after this, I have one more slide before I turn it over to Patrick. So this is some really common recovery pain points from a DR perspective of why clients would outtask DR to a service partner. Really about lack of expertise or lack of staff availability. 72% believe DR is not a core competency. We live in a world of complexity from a hybrid IT perspective. So 92% believe hybrid IT is very complex. 32% believe change management is hard to administer from a change perspective. And then lastly, the last pain point is really cost. A lot of clients are looking to reduce costs from a DR perspective. And then last is really the building blocks to recovery. There's 3 building blocks to recovery. It's really about how you protect your data. I talked about that. That's really the first layer of resiliency and recovery as a service. And then the second layer is really about how you really connect the data. And then the last layer is really how you manage it. Are you doing it? Is your service provider providing people, process, and governance around recovery? Patrick?
Well, thanks, Len. This is Stan jumping in. We do have our poll question. Our second poll question is up next. But before we get to that, there was an audience question for you, Len, that I'd like you to address now rather than during the Q&A, which will come a little later. And the question had to do with undersubscribed. What does that mean?
So what I mean about that is a lot of customers have subscriptions with us from a contractual perspective. And what I mean about undersubscribed is that there's gaps in their recovery. There's gaps from a production standpoint to what they contract for with us. So when I say undersubscribed, they may have a certain number of servers or storage in a contract, but they actually exceeded what they have in contract. So if they declared, they would have the ability to recover because they need more than what's on their contract today.
Right. They weren't fully protected, in other words.
Correct.
Okay. Just a quick reminder to members of our audience, please send us your questions. Just type it into the Q&A box, hit the submit button, and we'll answer it if we possibly can during the Q&A segment. We're going to go now to our second audience poll question of this webcast, and the question is, what steps have you taken to be ready for the next ransomware attack? You've got 5 choices. We've established application tiers. We've adopted a layered approach to cybersecurity. We've implemented an isolated recovery solution. All of the above, or finally none of the above. And on this one, please do select only one answer and be sure to hit the submit button, and we'll look at the results in just a minute. Len, back to you. How do you see people responding to this question?
Well, I think ransomware is the top of everybody's list today from a cyber perspective. So I'd be very surprised to see if the results when it comes back that it's on the top of their list and they've taken certain steps. I know that the Dell EMC SunGuard relationship, we've taken steps to put together solutions to address where in cyber from an isolated recovery perspective, and Patrick can talk more about that in a little bit.
All right. Well, let's move right ahead to the answers here. See how people voted on this one. Interestingly, none of the above, the big winner here. Patrick, what do you think about that?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. A lot of people may not even know what isolated recovery is, but that will change soon because I'll explain it. People have a hard time with the layered approach because it requires application mapping, and Len said that that's very difficult, and I agree. And a lot of people also have a hard time tiering their data. So, I think this WebEx is kind of good timing so we can better explain some of these recovery methods because cyber terrorism isn't going away. It's getting more prevalent, and I think our customers need to be prepared. So I think it's good timing that we have this conversation.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Patrick. I'll let you continue at this point.
Perfect. So great. Thanks, Len. Definitely educational on the type of attacks and reasons for people declaring emergencies and also being prepared. And I think the non-IT part of being prepared is super critical as we learned during 9/11. But here we are. We have emerging threats, and cyber extortion and cyber destruction are definitely emerging threats that we're going to see more and more of. These may run actually natural disasters as we move forward. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. So let's talk a little bit about that. So when we look to Verizon, they run a great report every year, and it talks about data breaches. And they report in 2016 that definitely breaches are growing exponentially, and they're led by hacking and malware. attackers are amazingly able to compromise organizations within 6 minutes in 60% of the cases, it's still likely that you won't discover this breach. So only 25% of it discovered it within days. And then we see that these are ideological motivated attacks, so people with a cause. So we see that this report highlights the ever-presence of cyber terrorism and some of the unpreparedness that we have as an industry moving forward. So, when we also look to what the government is doing, they've produced a interagency pamphlet in July of 2016, and they really point out the importance of backup. Backup has never been more important as far as recovering from cyber terrorism, so they're very critical in ransomware. They suggest that you back up regularly, that you secure these backups, and they introduce this concept of air gap, which is really a low-tech way of protecting data, and we'll talk about air gap in a second. They also talk about, verify the integrity. So just because you have things backed up, you should be verifying that with restoration and frequently recovering your data, and then also doing penetration tests and vulnerability assessments. So this is the new world we live in, and this is what we have to do and able to protect ourselves. It's a great pamphlet, and everyone will get the link here to download this pamphlet. So what we talk about next is just really the cost of, let's talk about ransomware. It's one thing to pay the ransom, and in one case we had a customer that paid a $30,000 ransom, but the lost revenue, the ability to respond, the legal advice, the productivity, there's a list of things that go along with ransomware, and the total attack in this case was $3.7 million. So huge losses when it comes to ransomware, and paying the ransom, we don't suggest that that's the case, but that's a small fraction of the cost when it comes to people recovering from ransomware. And it's being very easy for these rogue actors to hold data ransom. It used to be where people would go and steal data and sell it. Now they're knowing that this data is more valuable to you than it is to the open market, and they're holding your data ransom. We see that countless times, especially in the year 2017. So, when we look at traditional strategies, they just aren't enough. If we encrypt the data, that's fine, and you should encrypt data, but it's not going to help you from a ransomware attack. Tape backups, the problem with tape is that it is ultimately an air gap solution, but it takes very long to recover. There's not a lot of money that's being spent in R&D for tape, and it may not protect everything. So, for example, if you're backing up to disk and then writing to tape for long-term recovery, that backup to disk may be infected where the tape may not be infected. So we don't think that tape is a viable mechanism. And then when it comes to cyber insurance, it's great that you have insurance, but it doesn't really protect your brand, the loss of trust. It may cover you monetarily, but really the brand and loss of trust with your customers is going to be a bigger overall impact. And then not all breaches are covered with ransomware or insurance. So let's take a look at our partnership with SunGuard. When it comes to SunGuard, they are the experts in recovering data, and we are all in with SunGuard for our ability to protect data. So, we are the market leader, Dell EMC, in protecting data. I think that SunGuard, they have the ability to recover data. And like Len mentioned before, the more intricate your environment is, the better they are at recovering. A virtual environment is a lot easier to recover than a physical environment, and we know that there's still a lot of physical environments out there. And when you talk about SunGuard and their ability to recover data from the mainframe all the way into the cloud, it's really no one matches their capabilities. So we all know that when you protect your data and you back it up, that's one thing, but the restoration of that data is critical. And this part we leave up to SunGuard. They are the experts in recovering data, and they also have best-of-class data centers throughout the country and throughout the world that are available to customers. So we really have a strong relationship with SunGuard. We've had it for over 18 years, and we continue to leverage that partnership with our customers to provide this best-of-class recovery experience. But let's get to air gap. I mentioned air gap before. What is air gap? So many customers have a production data center and then a DR data center, and they have a network that goes between those two data centers, and they replicate their network. Now, what we see, though, is that people are very sophisticated when it comes to ransomware. And typically, if you get hit with ransomware, your first instinct is to recover from your backup. The problem is, and this is what we saw with Sony when they got attacked, is that many cases the rogue nation or the rogue actor, and 11% of the time it's an inside person that does this destruction or ransom, is actually destroying your backup data before they hold your data ransom. So they'll break into your backup environment and they will destroy that or compromise it, and then they will go hold your data ransom. So the first instinct for you is to recover that data from your backup, but you go to your backup and that backup's gone or it's compromised. So they're getting very sophisticated, and this is where we come in. So we have the ability with our data domain platform that's open systems and supports many, many different backup applications. We have the ability to create a third copy. And that third copy can be stored at your site or it can be stored at SunGuard. And what it allows you to do is back up your data to your production environment, replicate to your DR site, and then the data domain, without the application's knowledge, so without the backup application's knowledge, is able to send a third copy to a data domain. And when we're not replicating to that data domain, we shut down the link, and that's what creates this air gap. So we are only connected to that environment when we're replicating. Now, after we're done replicating, we take a worm copy of the data. So worm means write once, read many. And what it allows us to do is create an immutable copy on the data domain at that third site and store that for, say, 7 to 14 days. So when a ransomware attack happens or cyber terrorism, we are able to go and restore from this gold copy. Now, the key to this is we do a lot of security around this. For example, we have this third copy in a caged environment that only maybe a security person and an IT person. So two people have to produce the keys to get into the cage, and then two people have to be available and log in to manage that environment. So it makes the threat of this internal person much less, and it really creates this, data or storage of last resort, I will say. And we have many customers that have implemented this, and this is kind of the way that we protect you from ransomware and the way that these rogue actors aren't able to access this environment. The backup application doesn't even know that the data exists. Only data domain actually created that replication job, so it's a very powerful solution. And as far as SunGuard goes, they're fully on board. They offer this service, and this is an ultimate way for them to recover in the world of ransomware and cyber terrorism. So that's kind of the secret sauce with isolated recovery. Again, it's downing that link and making sure that that copy is all by itself very protected. But again, it goes to establishing application tiers. And one of the first things we do is we ask customers, what is the most mission critical thing to protect? So tiering the data is very important, and we know that not all applications within a company deserve the same type of data protection. So, for example, Len brought out synchronous data protection. We feel that that's for mission critical, and then we have best effort going down the line. Now, as it comes to cyber security, what we believe is that, number one, back up your data, whether it's at work or at home. The number one thing that you can do to protect yourself is to restore from ransomware, but to be able to restore, you have to back up. Kind of reminds me of all these wildfires that happen in California, and I can just imagine all the photos that are disappearing with these people's houses. There's no reason why your photo collection, from a consumer standpoint, shouldn't be in the cloud or in some type of removable media that you can take off site. But we think that ultimately, backup is what you need to do. Now, the second thing we think is you have to harden your backup. You have to make sure that people can't get into your backup system. You have to shut down ports. You have to change your passwords. You have to make it more stringent. You have to deploy encryption. You have to do retention mechanisms to make sure that that's immutable, that data. But then ultimately, as the storage of last resort, we feel that isolated recovery and this ability to create this link to a third site, namely being SunGuard, and being able to have data domain replicate that data and not exposing that to anyone within the organization is ultimately the best line of defense when it comes to cyber terrorism. So take a layered approach as far as cyber security. Always back up your data, harden that backup environment, and lastly, for mission critical, always do isolated recovery or create an air gap so that this is off the network protected, and Data Domain is a great platform to do that. So in looking at this, deploy EMC, Dell, and SunGuard into consulting with you. We want an environment that is isolated. When you do deploy it, periodically copy the data and restore it so you can see if it's viable. Always check the integrity of that data, and then come up with good procedures. And this, again, is a real strength of SunGuard, where they have years of experience with recovering data and can write run books and perform a recovery for you in the case of a ransomware attack. So with that, we'll do a question and answer session. I want to thank everyone for participating on this WebEx. You've taken the time out of your day to become more educated and more prepared as we talk about natural disasters and cyber terrorism, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That's great information. Well, let's go right now to the Q&A. We have a number of interesting questions, so let's go to the first one. The question is, what if we are still on tape as backup?
Yeah, so tape is the problem with tape is the time it takes to recover from tape. So if it's one application and you get held ransom, then you might be able to call back a tape from a provider and restore that data. But the issue is that the industry is moving beyond tape for data protection. Most of data protection now happens on disk with deduplication. The economics are there, and it doesn't really make sense to invest in technology that's not being invested in. We don't see huge investments into tape these days. There's only a few manufacturers that are making tape, and we don't think that that's a viable way to move forward. Having said that, it is an air gap solution, and if you're not going to do anything, you should definitely be backing up, and if that's to tape, then that's fine, but we just don't see that as a viable way to move forward just because of the pure time it takes to recover from tape.
Len, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree with Patrick. Tape is still obviously a viable way to recover your business. It all depends on the recovery time objective for the applications. A lot of customers today are still recovering via tape because maybe the application can recover within, say, 48 hours. Maybe it's a back office application that still requires it to be on tape, and that's still viable. But like Patrick said, a lot of clients are moving away from tape only because they want faster, more efficient recovery times for applications.
All right, let's move ahead to the next question. Can the SunGuard Dell EMC solution help us be better prepared for GDPR? That's the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union. Yeah,
so GDPR is interesting. It goes into effect in March 2018. It's a European law, but definitely U.S. companies are affected if they do business in Europe. And we'll start to see more of these regulations. But going back to kind of what Len said, as far as, identifying the application, look at the application mapping, look at your archive strategy. It's really a business conversation that IT folks have to have with the business. These regulation fines are very stiff, and the key to this is really identifying the data you have and making sure it's stored on the right platform and making sure you're not storing certain information that maybe you were before. So it's a great law as far as privacy goes for the consumer. And we believe that there's going to be a lot of money spent with GDPR as people prepare for this regulation, but it all comes down to kind of high-level discussions with IT people and business people to ensure that you meet that regulation. And ultimately, you'll be better off because your data will be stored in the right place at the right time and accessible accordingly.
All right, let's move ahead to our next question. How do you ensure that the ransomware or malware doesn't affect the third site, the isolated recovery environment?
So great question. So when we replicate the data, we have maybe 7 to 14 days of data that existed at the time when we did the replication. So we can recover back 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, customers maybe 30 days. And we believe that, number one, there is scans that happen on this data to check for integrity. And number two is that, if the ransom was not enacted yesterday, then yesterday's data is okay. And then also, when we hold this data in this isolated recovery area, we're able to maybe fix that data before it goes back into production. So we think that, there is a chance that malware or ransomware can get into this vault, but we think that if you look at the way that we do it and all the security that's involved and the mechanism, this is your best way to recover from malware or cyber terrorism.
All right. We're running a bit short of time, so I'm going to thank both Len and Patrick for their great information in this webcast. And sincere thanks once again to Len Guddemi, Vice President of Enterprise Solutions Recovery as a Service, MRP for SunGuard Availability Services, and to Patrick Kenny, Director in the Data Protection Division of Dell EMC, for explaining why increasing risks call for new approaches to disaster recovery and how isolated recovery in particular can help organizations defend themselves against ransomware. For more information on this topic, please click on the green Resources icon on your screen. And thanks for joining us. For SunGuard, Dell EMC, and IDG, I'm Stan Gibson.